Nuclear weapons are the most brutal weapons in the long history of human warfare. Nuclear weapons are not just terrifying killing machines, but rather symbols of an apocalypse created by humans themselves. They only need one button to wipe out entire cities, civilizations, and human hope in an instant. The story of nuclear weapons began amidst the turmoil of World War II. In late 1938, German scientists discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms that could release immense energy. This news quickly spread among scientists worldwide. In the United States, scientists who had fled Europe, including great figures like Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, warned President Roosevelt that, with the discovery of nuclear fission, Germany might be developing an extraordinary weapon of mass destruction. After weighing Einstein's letter and the danger that could be posed by German-made brutal weapons, a secret project was launched to create the strongest weapon in the world before Germany succeeded. This project was called the Manhattan Project, which officially ran from June 18, 1942 to August 25, 1947, employing over 130,000 people at various secret facilities. President Roosevelt approved the production of the atomic bomb in January 1942, marking the beginning of an unprecedented military effort. In August 1942, the Manhattan Engineer District was established, and in October of the same year, it was decided to establish a separate scientific laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, specifically for designing the atomic bomb. In this project, great scientists from all over the world, including Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, Einstein, and others, joined to design the extraordinary weapon of destruction. In this project, Oppenheimer led the team to transform theory into reality. On December 6, 1942, under the stands of the University of Chicago Stadium, Enrico Fermi successfully conducted the world's first controlled nuclear chain reaction, which then became the scientific foundation for the atomic bomb. After this success, the government immediately established a giant uranium enrichment plant in Tennessee, while a plutonium production facility was built in Hanford, Washington. Scientists seemed to be racing against time. Behind strict secrecy, scientists worked day and night, driven by the fear that Germany might be one step ahead. But by the summer of 1945, Germany had surrendered in World War II, meaning the fear of German weapons of mass destruction was over. Nevertheless, the war in the Pacific was still raging fiercely. Japan, fueled by ambition, continued to launch brutal attacks and resistance. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project finally produced 3 ready-to-use nuclear bombs, each with a code name: Gadget, Little Boy, and Fat Man. On July 16, 1945, a team of American scientists and soldiers conducted a test known as the Trinity Test. The plutonium device, named Gadget, was detonated on a 100-foot tower in Jornada del Muerto, New Mexico, at 5:30 a.m. This explosion released an explosive power of 20,000 tons of TNT, instantly vaporizing the tower and transforming the asphalt and sand around it. This became the world's first nuclear explosion. From a scientific marvel that then became an existential threat, the Trinity Test marked a horrific turning point. It is said that after witnessing the immense power of the explosion, Oppenheimer, one of the bomb's creators, quoted from the Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Oppenheimer's quote was not merely an expression of power, but reflected a deep awareness among the creators that they had unleashed a force with existential implications for humanity, far beyond conventional warfare. Oppenheimer had directly grasped the horror and grandeur of the power they had just unleashed. This moment crystallized the ethical dilemma inherent in nuclear weapons. a scientific victory that simultaneously presented an unprecedented threat to human survival. Meanwhile, the other 2 atomic bombs were stored for possible use in real combat. The success of the Trinity test, with its explosion reaching 20,000 tons of TNT, convinced the United States that this new weapon worked. President Truman, who had only been in office for a few months after Roosevelt's death, faced a very difficult decision. Would they drop nuclear bombs on Japanese cities to quickly end the war, or would they let the war continue without knowing when it would end? Truman fully understood that Japan still refused to surrender, despite being in a desperate situation. A conventional invasion of Japan was estimated to result in hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Meanwhile, the atomic bomb promised a terrifying shortcut. So, in the end, without much moral debate among his war advisors, Truman decided to use the new weapon to force Japan to surrender unconditionally. Several targets were chosen, cities that had not been destroyed by conventional bombing, so that the impact of the atomic bomb would maximally demonstrate its power. Hiroshima was at the top of that target list. A secret order was immediately issued. As soon as the weather permitted, the terrifying bomb would be dropped, and the world would soon witness a dark new chapter in the history of human warfare. That morning, August 6, 1945, Hiroshima greeted the sun as usual. The city, with a population of about 350,000, had never been heavily bombed, so daily life was quite normal despite Japan being ravaged by war. Air raid sirens had sounded at dawn, a routine warning when U.S. reconnaissance planes were passing. But residents were used to it and did not evacuate. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the shadow of a fate-carrying plane passed high in the sky. A Superfortress bomber named Enola Gay had just dropped something from its bomb bay. It was the 4-ton Little Boy atomic bomb, which began to freefall towards the city center. Then, 43 seconds later, it reached its target. A dazzling white flash of light, brighter than 1,000 suns, seemed to split the city's sky. The bomb exploded about 600 meters above the ground, directly over a surgical clinic in the city center. In a fraction of a second, the nuclear reaction released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, with temperatures at the explosion point reaching over 4,000 degrees Celsius. The ground surface beneath the giant fireball was scorched to about 3,900 degrees Celsius in less than 1 second. This immense heat and light incinerated everything within close proximity. Humans and animals within 800 meters of the explosion point were instantly vaporized. Their bodies vanished without a trace, leaving only faint shadows on the walls and stairs where they had been. Those very close to ground zero did not even have time to feel pain. So intense was the heat that the human nervous system did not even have time to send pain signals to the brain, because their bodies had already turned to ash. The flash of heat even burned the skin of people several kilometers away, causing instant burns. Immediately after the flash, a powerful shockwave followed. The air expanded super fast from the center of the explosion, creating an overpressure equivalent to thousands of kgm2, leveling every building. This shockwave traveled at a speed of about 984 km/h, far exceeding any storm on Earth. Thousands of houses and buildings collapsed instantly. Tiles and windows were thrown, becoming deadly projectiles. The air blast triggered a firestorm that engulfed Hiroshima. Oxygen sucked into the center of the fire created strong winds, causing the fire to spread rapidly. Within minutes, most of the city turned into a sea of fire and rubble. A giant mushroom cloud rising 12 kilometers into the sky carried highly radioactive dust into the atmosphere. From afar, the cloud looked like something alive, raging in anger, exhaling the breath of hell. Casualties instantly fell in unimaginable numbers. About 80,000 people were estimated to have died instantly when the bomb exploded. Then tens of thousands more suffered severe injuries, including horrific burns. A few hours after the explosion, black radioactive rain fell in some areas, carrying highly radioactive dust particles and soot. Survivors, known in Japan as hibakusha, who were not severely injured, immediately tried to help others. Although many of them themselves suffered burns and temporary blindness due to the glare of the explosion, hospitals were instantly destroyed. Medical personnel were killed or injured, so there was almost no help. Thousands of people died in the following days from injuries and radiation. This became a new chapter that added to the suffering. Those who appeared to have survived without external injuries began to show strange symptoms a few days later, such as vomiting, high fever, bloody diarrhea, hair loss, and so on. This syndrome later became known as acute radiation sickness. Many people died from it in the following weeks. By the end of 1945, the total death toll in Hiroshima was estimated to be over 140,000 people, including direct deaths and those due to radiation and injuries. Even those who survived carried physical scars and psychological trauma for life. The tragic event in Hiroshima was just the beginning. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, a B-29 named Boxcar flew through the cloudy sky carrying the plutonium bomb Fat Man, which was even more powerful than Little Boy. The initial target was the city of Kokura. However, Kokura's fate was saved by thick clouds that enveloped the city that morning. After circling 3 times but the target was not clearly visible, the Boxcar pilot decided to switch to the secondary target named Nagasaki, a port city in the south with a population of about 240,000. Around 11 a.m. local time, sirens began to wail in Nagasaki, warning residents of the air danger. Fortunately, many had already evacuated to shelters after the sirens sounded twice that morning. However, the cloudy sky gave false hope. Many thought that the bomber could not drop a bomb without seeing the target. But in reality, in just a matter of seconds, something plummeted from the high-flying Boxcar. Fat Man was released and exploded about 500 meters above Nagasaki's Urakami Industrial District. Instantly, a giant fireball expanded over the city, followed by a mushroom cloud that towered very high. This explosion was even more powerful, with a force of about 22 kilotons of TNT, slightly larger than the Hiroshima bomb. In an instant, the Urakami Valley, the point of the explosion, was completely destroyed. Temperatures at the center of the explosion again reached thousands of degrees Celsius, burning everything in its vicinity. Thousands of people in the area were instantly killed by burns or falling debris. Passing trains even melted. Rows of fuel tanks at the pier burst and burned fiercely. However, Nagasaki's hills limited the reach of the shockwave, so the damage covered a narrower area compared to Hiroshima. Nevertheless, that narrower damage was still very horrifying, as about 40,000 people were killed instantly that day. Tens of thousands more suffered severe injuries. Many died in the following days from burns or radiation. By the end of 1945, the total death toll in Nagasaki was estimated to be around 74,000 people. For Japan, these 2 successive attacks were a devastating blow. Moreover, The second attack came simultaneously with the news that the Soviet Union suddenly reneged on its neutrality pact and declared war on Japan on August 8th, invading Manchuria. On August 10, 1945, the Japanese government finally sent a signal of willingness to surrender to the Allies, provided that the Emperor's safety was guaranteed. After negotiations on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke over the radio, announcing Japan's capitulation and ending World War II. In that speech, he mentioned that the enemy had begun to use a new, cruelest bomb that had caused countless damage to innocent people. The atomic bomb explosions in Japan marked the end of World War II. But on the other hand, they also opened the curtain on the nuclear era. The United States at that time was at the peak of its power, not only as the victor of the war, but also monopolizing the secrets of the most powerful weapon in the world. The euphoria of victory was soon followed by the realization that a powerful monster had been unleashed from its cage. Just a few weeks after Japan surrendered, on January 24, 1946, the UN General Assembly issued Resolution No. 1, calling for the total elimination of atomic weapons from national armaments. The international community, which had just risen from the ruins of World War II, recognized that this new weapon was too dangerous to be allowed to trigger a new war. The United States itself proposed an international agreement known as the Baruch Plan to prevent nuclear proliferation, the essence of which was that all nuclear materials and projects would be under UN supervision. However, unfortunately, mutual suspicion between the newly emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, thwarted this agreement. The Soviets, suspicious because the United States was reluctant to destroy its bomb stockpiles, rejected the plan, so the UN resolution remained a moral appeal. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Manhattan Project continued even after the war ended. The development of the next generation of atomic bombs continued, but it was not long before the United States lost its status as the sole nuclear power. The Soviet Union, which had been secretly working on its own atomic program since 1943, had its scientists racing against time to avoid falling too far behind. So, on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear bomb, and the world officially entered the era of the nuclear arms race. The 1949 Soviet test explosion surprised the Western world. The United States had initially hoped its nuclear monopoly would last at least a decade, but it only lasted 4 years. The two superpowers, former allies, then became ideological rivals, both holding nuclear weapons. In 1950, the Cold War broke out, a tense indirect conflict between the Western Bloc, represented by the United States and its NATO allies, and the Eastern Bloc, represented by the Soviet Union and its communist allies. This Cold War cast the shadow of nuclear war over the world. In the 1950s, nuclear technology developed even faster. If the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were fission-based atomic bombs, the splitting of uranium or plutonium atoms, scientists soon sought a far more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb, which was based on fusion, the merging of light atomic nuclei. The hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear bomb, promised many times the explosive power of an atomic bomb. Driven by news of Soviet progress, President Truman in 1950 ordered the creation of the hydrogen bomb. Just 2 years after the Soviet Union tested its atomic bomb, the United States successfully detonated its first hydrogen bomb on November 1, 1952. The test, named Ivy Mike, produced a colossal explosion of about 10 megatons, or about 10 million tons of TNT, meaning 500 times more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb. The island where the test took place practically vanished from the map. The mushroom cloud rose to the edge of space. However, the Soviet Union did not want to be outdone by the United States. So in August 1953, the Soviet Union conducted its first hydrogen test. Just 9 months after the United States, the Soviet Union was on par in possessing a super bomb. The world witnessed a horrifying escalation of weapon power. From dozens of kilotons in Hiroshima, it was now measured in megatons. And most terrifyingly, every new power achieved by one side was immediately balanced by the other. Not only the United States and the Soviet Union, but other countries soon followed suit. Great Britain became the third country to test an atomic bomb in 1952, followed by France in 1960, and then China in 1964. These 5 countries would later be known as official nuclear weapon states according to the UN, because they already possessed nuclear weapons before the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. From then on, the world entered a phase of quality competition. The United States focused on improving missile accuracy and diversifying launch platforms. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union briefly pursued a strategy of super-large bombs. The peak occurred on October 30th, 1961, when the Soviet Union detonated the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear bomb ever tested by humankind. This monster explosion had a power of about 50 megatons, or 50 million tons of TNT, meaning up to 3,300 times the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb. The Tsar Bomba's mushroom cloud rose 60 kilometers into the atmosphere, with a width of 100 kilometers at its peak. Its shockwave shattered window panes as far as 900 kilometers away. It was even reportedly heard as far as Dixon Island, hundreds of kilometers away. Everything within a 35-kilometer radius of the explosion point vanished in flames, and buildings were destroyed up to a radius of 150 kilometers. This test was so devastating that the crew of the bomber only had a 50% chance of survival, even though the bomb was dropped with a parachute to give them time to escape. Tsar Bomba was purely a show of Soviet strength to shock the world, and the world was indeed very stunned. Fortunately, both the United States and the Soviet Union soon understood that such brutal bombs were not practical for war. So, after Tsar Bomba, both countries agreed to refrain from testing super-large bombs. Even the Soviet scientists who designed it later turned into anti-nuclear activists because they were horrified by the results produced on the environment. Starting in the early 1960s, anti-nuclear protests also spread in various countries. The global public, presented with horrifying images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims and increasing concerns about the radioactive effects of atmospheric tests, became more vocal in demanding no more Hiroshimas. As a result, a number of nuclear arms control treaties began to be realized. The first step came in 1963 through the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, this treaty sought to stop global radioactive pollution from atmospheric tests. Although underground tests were still allowed, this prohibition at least curbed the pace of wild experiments like the Tsar Bomba. Then, in 1967, the Treaty of Tlatelolco made Latin America a nuclear weapon-free zone. This was followed by Antarctica in 1959, the South Pacific in 1985, Southeast Asia in 1995, and Africa in 1996. The world slowly formed pockets of regions where nuclear testing was prohibited, and most importantly, in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, was produced. The NPT is a global agreement where the 5 official nuclear weapon states, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China, pledged not to help other countries acquire nuclear weapons and committed to future disarmament negotiations. Other countries agreed not to seek nuclear weapons and gained access to civilian nuclear technology in return. The NPT came into force in 1970 and is now recognized by 191 countries. Although this treaty is considered a major milestone in curbing the wider spread of atomic bombs, there are several countries that later violated or did not join the NPT, such as India, Pakistan, and Israel. All 3 developed nuclear weapons outside the NPT, as well as North Korea, which withdrew from the NPT in 2003 and tested its first nuclear bomb in 2006. India always felt itself to be an ancient civilization that could not be forced to submit to rules made after its birth. So, when the NPT was proposed, India viewed the treaty as flawed from the start. Then, not long after India showed its teeth through a nuclear explosion in 1974, Pakistan knew it had no other choice. The country had long been at odds with India, especially over the Kashmir region. So if India had the ultimate weapon, Pakistan had to have it too. Pakistan refused to submit to the NPT for similar reasons: discrimination. But more than that, they also felt insecure. That is, if their neighbor had nuclear weapons, how could Pakistan sleep peacefully without similar protection? Thus began Pakistan's secret project. Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan, a nuclear scientist who would later be considered both a hero and controversial, became a central figure. With an extensive network and meticulous intelligence work, Pakistan finally successfully tested its first nuclear bomb in May 1998, just 2 weeks after India conducted its second test. Since then, South Asia has become a region with 2 hostile nuclear-armed states, separated only by mountains and historical grievances. Meanwhile, in the international community, everyone knows that Israel has nuclear weapons, but officially Israel has never admitted it, nor has it ever denied it. This policy is known as ambiguity policy. Israel has not signed the NPT, and they feel no need to explain it. Unlike the others, North Korea initially signed the NPT, but as explained, the country later officially withdrew in 2003 after years of disputes with the International Atomic Energy Agency and being accused of concealing its nuclear activities. In 2006, North Korea surprised the world with its first nuclear test. At that time, the world was very angry, and sanctions were imposed. Nevertheless, North Korea became even more stubborn. They knew that the world could attack Iraq because it had no weapons of mass destruction, but against North Korea, the world would think twice. Nuclear weapons have become the heart of the Kim regime's survival strategy. Every time international pressure increases, North Korea displays its missiles, launches tests, and sends a clear message: never touch us. In any case, the NPT is one reason why nuclear weapons have never been used again since 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and now more than 80 years later, no nuclear bombs have been dropped on the battlefield. But of course, the NPT is not the only reason, but rather a combination of military, political, and moral factors known as the nuclear taboo. First, the destructive power of nuclear weapons makes them unusable for limited military purposes. The explosion of just one bomb can kill hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, as happened in Japan. After the war ended, the horror stories of radiation victims and images of destroyed cities spread throughout the world. As a result, the international community viewed the use of atomic bombs as a barbaric act that was too horrific. Second, the deterrence factor and the risk of retaliation. This means that once more than one country has nuclear weapons, the situation is like two opponents pointing pistols at each other's heads, where if one pulls the trigger, both will die. This is what is called mutually assured destruction. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that if they launched nuclear weapons first, their opponent would still have enough weapons left to retaliate, so the attacker would also be destroyed. This deterrence successfully prevented the two superpowers from engaging in direct war. That is why armed conflicts between them were diverted to proxy wars or other competitions outside direct military channels, because no party could win a nuclear war. And third, international pressure and the threat of isolation. If a country dared to use nuclear weapons first, it would almost certainly be ostracized by the world. Global condemnation would come from both friends and foes. For example, when the United States considered the option of tactical nuclear weapons to destroy enemy underground bunkers, it immediately drew strong protests from European allies and international public opinion. And clearly, the use of nuclear weapons would violate humanitarian principles in international humanitarian law due to their indiscriminate effects on civilians and the environment.